Greetings and welcome back. In the last mini lecture, I told you that when we look at dual versus cooperative federalism, there tends to be a dividing line. That before the Great Depression, the emphasis seems to be on the national government and the states competing. And with the Great Depression, we tend to look more at cooperation and partnerships. And so I think I need to discuss the impact of the Great Depression. For me personally, growing up as a child, and you guys know I'm 62, I was born in 1958. The Great Depression was the defining political event of my grandparents' life. And my grandparents were very different age. My oldest grandparent was born in 1908, so when the Depression hit in 1929, my grandfather was 21. He was married. He had one child. His second child, which would be my father, was born during the Depression. My youngest grandparent was born in 1920, so when the Great Depression hit in 1929, she was in elementary school. She was 9 years old. And whether we're talking about my oldest or my youngest or my two grandparents in between, all of them told stories of how horrifying the Great Depression was and how scary it was. And to demonstrate with just my oldest grandparent, my grandfather, Randall, back in Kentucky, his whole life after the Great Depression, he hid money in the garage in case another Great Depression occurred. In fact, after he died, he wrote to my cousins and to my grandma and my aunt places in the garage that he'd hidden money. Think about that. My grandfather died in 1984. The Great Depression had ended in the 1930s, and it was such a horrifying event that more than 50 years or so, or 50 years after the Depression, he was still being impacted by the Depression, in this case by squirreling away money in the garage in case the banks closed. He would have money that he could access. So this was a horrifying event, 25% official unemployment, maybe 40 or 50% underemployment, and that was my grandfather. He stoked coal in a furnace, and as a second job, he was a barber and cut hair. So we get a new president, Franklin Roosevelt, in 1932. He runs for the presidency against Herbert Hoover. Roosevelt, of course, wins the presidency in 1933 and is the only president to win four consecutive elections. And of course, he died early in his fourth term in 1945. But Roosevelt, when he ran for the presidency, ran essentially on this new mantra of cooperative federalism. Roosevelt said that the problems of American society are so great that we can no longer think about governments as being competitors. We should no longer think of government as being distant and aloof and not part of our life. In this case, the problems of American society are so great that the national government and the states have to become partners to throw an economic life preserver to solve the damage caused by the Depression. And of course, the famous Roosevelt response to the Great Depression was called the New Deal. Now, if you take a look at your notes, the New Deal was not a lot of new programs. The New Deal was 16, that's it, 16 new grant programs that were designed to stimulate economic recovery from the Depression. And you certainly should star that. That is something you're likely to see. But contrast that with Lyndon Johnson. We're going to talk about him later. And the Great Society. And when we talk about the Great Society, we're talking about over 200 new grant programs, including 109 of them in 1965 alone. So, in terms of number of programs, the Roosevelt New Deal is not nearly as large in terms of quantity as the Great Society, but it is a fundamental shift in the role and responsibility of the national government. The most famous program, you should start, you're well aware of it. Some of you may even have your little blue Social Security card on you as you listen to this lecture. The most famous of these 16 grant programs was the Social Security Act of 1935 that many, and I would agree with this, that many claim was the cornerstone of the modern welfare state. Now I want you to take a look at those numbers that are in your notes that I have titled Government Spending by Sector. Government Spending by Sector, 1929 to 1939. Take a look. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, look at the government that was spending by far the most money. In fact, the governmental level that was spending more money than the other two combined. Local governments in America were spending 60% of all government spending was done by local governments. And local governments were spending money essentially on the two items that still are big budget items at the local level. They were spending money on public education, and they were spending money on public protection, courts, cops, and jails. Notice that when the Depression hit in 1929, the national government was spending the least amount of money. But notice what happened with the Great Depression and with Franklin Roosevelt and with the New Deal. And of course, by 1939, the U.S. government was beginning to spend more for the first time on the military than they had spent since World War I. And take a look at 1939. The U.S. is not involved in World War II. World War II is raging in 1939. The U.S. is not involved in this war directly until 1941. But if you look at 1939, you will notice that the national government is now spending nearly half of all tax dollars. The national government is spending more money than local governments and more money than states. So in that 10-year period, we see governmental spending change dramatically. And I don't want you to get the wrong idea here. I am not telling you that local and state governments are spending less money in 1939 than in 1929. They're not. Governments at all levels are spending more money in 1939 than 1929. Local, state, and the national government, they're all spending substantially more money in 1939 than they were in 1929. But the national government is spending a lot more money. And now the national government has massively increased the amount of grant money that they're giving to cities, for example. So the Great Depression is really synonymous with this shift towards partnership, that only the national government has the deep pockets, that only the national government can resolve problems of national scale. And so certainly Greenberg and Page, your textbook authors, are huge fans, as I said, of the national government. They believe the national government should be larger and more powerful. And that is essentially their argument, that the problems that face American society today are national in scope, and national problems need national solutions. By the end of the Depression, both Democrats and Republicans both favored this notion that the national government had added powers, responsibilities. Even people who today we associate with conservatism, like Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, of course, became a conservative Republican president in the 1980s. But Ronald Reagan was a Roosevelt New Deal Democrat when he was younger. And when asked why did he change, he said, I didn't change. I still favor things like Social Security. I still believe that the government has an obligation to help those who cannot help themselves, who are most in need. What I opposed was what came later, the explosion of government under the Great Society. And to demonstrate the fact that both Democrats and Republicans had bought into this notion of partnerships and only the national government resolving national problems, I give you Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower was president when I was born. Eisenhower's greatest accomplishment at home, in my opinion, is the creation of the interstate highway system. Now, Eisenhower was a fiscal conservative. He believed in balanced budgets, a far different cry than either party today. And you'll notice in the notes that Eisenhower balanced the federal budget 7 of the 8 years he was president. But while he was president, he advocated an incredibly costly program which became the interstate highway system. Now, Eisenhower did this for 2 reasons. One was he believed that if there was a modern interstate highway system that could link every major city of size, it would facilitate interstate commerce and it would create a major boom to the economy. The second reason for the Interstate Highway Act was the United States was involved in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. There was fear that this Cold War might go hot and that there might be a nuclear exchange. And in this particular case, by having a modern interstate highway system, the United States could rapidly, mobily move missiles from one place to another to make them harder to target by the Soviets. And if any of you have ever driven down Interstate 5 versus, say, Highway 99, you'll notice a whole bunch of differences. There are a lot more conditions that come with an interstate highway than come with a state highway, and one of them is the overpasses are much higher, you'll notice, on an interstate highway than on a state highway. The thickness, the bedding of the highway is different. The length of the on-ramps and off-ramps are different on an interstate highway than on a state highway. You see, before the creation of the interstate highway system, the state highways were not very coordinated. You had to go right through the middle of town. So here in Merced, Old Highway 99, and this is just a state highway, and we built a new state highway, but even on a state highway like 99, you had to go right through the middle of Merced. Old Highway 99 was 16th Street, so you'd have to stop at all the lights. In Turlock, Golden State was Old Highway 99. Again, you'd have to go through town, and it was burdensome. And so more modern highways had bypasses, so you didn't have to stop at all the lights, and you can get from one location to another very quickly. Now, Eisenhower paid for the interstate highway system by introducing a gas tax. Essentially, the notion was that as people buy gasoline for their cars and they use the interstate highway system, that would be a user tax. The people who drive the most miles will pay the most in taxes and pay for the interstate highway system. The interstate highway system is a marvel. The odd numbers, for example, right, Interstate 5 is the westernmost north-south highway. 95 is the easternmost north-south highway, and your even numbers starting with 90 in the north and 10 in the south are your east-west highways. So at any given time on an interstate highway, you know if that highway is to the north of you, to the south of you, to the east of you, or to the west of you, even if your GPS fails. In the next lecture, we'll talk about the Great Society and the full bloom of cooperative federalism.